As a child of divorce, you can imagine that my parents' marriage has had both the negative and positive ramifications on my life personally. With that being said, in this speech, you should listen to me because marriage affects our society in more ways than one. Marriage shapes our society and our way of life. Judgment is often passed dependent upon your marital status, and in some cases, this could be both positive and or detrimental to your situation. Funk and Wagnalls in the New World Encyclopedia in 2014 explain, the family unit provides a framework for most human social activity, and since it is the foundation on which most cultures base their social organization, marriage is closely tied to family, economics, law, and religion. With that being said, it just proves the point that marriage is reaching farther than just our intermediate family. It's reaching farther and farther and farther than we actually begin to think about in our everyday lives. Funk and Wagnalls, as previously qualified, continue. The sociocultural implications of marriage, sexuality, and parent-progeny relations creates an interesting and important branch of behavioral science today. Again, essentially, these quotes are explaining just how far the reaches of marriage extends. It's not just between our families and our cousins and things like that. It reaches farther than that. So, in this speech, I will discuss marriage as depicted by our individual communities and our society today. First, I will talk about the rich history of marriage as a universal ritual. Second, I will discuss marriage and its variations, particularly in the Islamic faith. And finally, I will discuss how marriage is continuously evolving. So, first, we're going to take a look at the history of marriage as a universal ritual. So, many historians speculate that various reasons caused the creation of marriage. One of the most important and standout reasons would be to create social ties and family ties between two separate groups of people. In order for these two separate groups of people to come together and create a union, or create a strong front, a union has to be made between two of their offspring. With that being said, this creates power between the two and keeps it within this unit. Now, in order to keep it within this created unit, oftentimes you had cousins marrying cousins and sisters and brothers and second cousins and things like that in order to keep the money, power, and wealth within this unit and instead of spreading it out. So polygamy and incest and things like that were more common back in the day. And another major factor that created the institution of marriage would be procreation. In order to ensure the proper care and raising of a child, marriage had to come together. The two parents had to be together to ensure that this child was getting everything that it needed. Now, from a religious standpoint, in Catholicism and Judaism, they both believed that Adam and Eve were the start of marriage, this union of two separate souls coming together. As far as procreation and things like that, they also have the same criteria, social obligations and things like that. So now that we've taken a brief look at the history of marriage, we're going to talk about marriage as depicted in the Islamic faith. Now, some of you may or may not know is that the Islamic faith is Abrahamic in its roots, which means that Judaism and Catholicism and the Islamic faith all have the same origins. So with that being said, they have a lot of the same qualifications and criteria for marriage, meaning that it's between a man and a woman, it's a union of two separate souls coming together, procreation, and things like that. One of the major standout differences between Islam and some of our mainstream religions is that Islam allows for a man to take multiple wives. This is a pretty uncommon practice, but it is allowed. So it's something that sets our mainstream or more common religion apart from Islam. So now we've taken a brief look at the Islamic faith. We're going to discuss how marriage is continuously evolving. As I stated before, marriage started off as something that would bring families together, two separate groups together, and as it evolved from that, it took a trip more down a religious standpoint. So as marriage began to become a staple in our society today, it starts to move away from its religious background. Now, with that being said, in the past, it wasn't legal for same-sex marriages to happen because it was against the religion. But as it stands now, the farther and farther that we get along in our society, marriage is beginning to adapt to our social norms. With that being said, now 37 out of the 50 states allow same-sex marriages. And that's an important milestone for us to reach, and it's a great accomplishment with that. And let's just say 50 years ago, that wasn't allowed. So it just stands to prove that marriage will continue to evolve and has evolved from its origins. So in this speech, we have discussed a brief history of the brief history of marriage as a universal ritual. Second, we discuss Islam and its views on marriage. And finally, we discuss the history of marriage. I think it's important that as a society, we understand and grow to learn the history of marriage, since it is such a constant in our world today. It also helps us better understand each other and have a better understanding of how to relate to one another. Thanks for listening.